Welcome back to the Product Operations Summit. Before we get going with the next session, we would like to take a moment to thank our sponsors for helping us bring this awesome event to your screens. And don't forget, you can access even more content from past and future events on demand by becoming a PLA member. Head on over to productledalliance.com for more information. Enjoy the next session.
Hello, everyone. Incredibly great to be here at this virtual event, even though we're not all together in person. Really great to be talking to all of you today. I'm going to dive right into things. Today, we're going to be talking about how to prioritize accessibility issues, because there's a lot of thinking that is beginning to happen when it comes to accessibility and making sure that the digital products and services and websites we create are accessible and usable by everyone, whether they're a person with a disability or not. But there's a journey that a lot of us have to go on. And part of that journey is figuring out how exactly to prioritize all of these different issues and how to fix things in ways that work for our users and for us. Before I get into the meat of the talk, tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Sam Prue. I am the accessibility evangelist here at Fable. So I get to spend a lot of time going to conferences just like this one, giving presentations, talking, writing, podcasting about accessibility and inclusive design, and really raising not just my own voice as a person with a disability. I'm a completely blind screen reader user. I've been using screen readers for my entire life, but raising the voices of other people with disabilities and keeping the conversations about accessibility and usability and inclusivity for people with disabilities really centered and at the forefront of everything that we do here at Fable, and trying to keep the accessibility thinking and conversing and discussion at the forefront of what we do when we're designing and building products and websites and services. When I'm not talking accessibility, I am hanging out over on Reddit. I'm one of the moderators of R Blind, which is the official subreddit of blind and visually impaired folks. Great place to check in if you're interested in what that community is thinking about and talking about. We're 17,000 folks strong at the moment. And other than that, I spend my time reading science fiction and fantasy ebooks because the future is a wonderful, amazing place. And I love thinking about the future and what it can bring us in equality and inclusion, whether it's part of my day job or whether it's a fun hobby escape. I did mention that I am the accessibility evangelist here at Fable. And so I'd love to tell you a little bit more about what Fable does so that you sort of understand where I'm coming from and the approach that we take here at Fable. Fable helps you create true and lasting accessibility, whether you're building something new or remediating something existing. We do it by making it easy to hear from people with disabilities in every part of your accessibility journey. It starts with Fable Upskill, custom video-based accessibility training that centers the experiences of assistive technology users. Fable Upskill makes it easy for everyone on your team to get the accessibility knowledge they need, no matter their role or current expertise. It continues with Fable Engage, allowing you to apply insights gained from the actual experiences of assistive technology users during every phase of your product development cycle. Quick turnaround times, flexible engagement types, and measurable results make it easy to create meaningful accessibility improvement. You can find out more about Fable and what we do at makeitfable.com, and you can follow us on our LinkedIn or Twitter. That said, let's jump right in to the talk today. So what are we going to be talking about when we think about prioritizing accessibility issues? We're going to be talking about the importance of distributing accessibility throughout your team. We're going to be spending some time talking about rethinking accessibility and what it means and what it is and who it benefits. We're going to be cover automated testing and when that is the right tool for the job. And then we're going to move on to user testing and why that is important to build on top of your automated testing framework. And then we're going to talk about prioritizing based on the results of your automated testing and your user testing, and how to really make sure that you are making remediations that are as impactful and meaningful to all of your users as they possibly can be. So I know we've only got a little bit of time. So let's dive right in and let's talk about rethinking accessibility. That may seem like a bit of an odd place to start when we're talking about how to prioritize accessibility issues and how to prioritize making fixes, but bear with me because I think correctly understanding what disability means, what accessibility means, and who and how it benefits is a critical facet of understanding our work as project managers and product developers when it comes to creating better and more accessible experiences for everyone. So let's start off by really talking about how and why accessibility is for everyone. And there are two ways that accessibility is for everyone. First of all, accessibility is for everyone because people with disabilities, in a very real way, are everyone. When you hear the phrase person with a disability or people with disabilities, you may be tempted to fall into the trap of thinking, oh, this is just a tiny percentage of the population that we need to do all of this work for. We don't have any customers who are people with disabilities. We don't have any employees or users who are people with disabilities. And that couldn't be further from the truth. First of all, of course, because 1 in 5 people identify as being a person with a disability right now. And so that 1 in 5 people makes up an incredibly huge market segment and user segment. However, people with disabilities go beyond that 1 in 5 people. There is a model of disability that is talked about that I think is really useful and important for us to spend a couple of moments thinking about. And that is 3 types of disability. First off, there's permanent disability. And that'll be someone like me. I was born blind. I am completely blind. I have no vision whatsoever. And odds are that I will be blind for my entire life. And so I have a permanent disability. However, there are also temporary disabilities. That can be someone who broke their arm or who broke their leg in an accident. It could be somebody who is undergoing a medical procedure that limits your ability to see or hear or be exposed to certain things, or that changes your cognition due to changes in your medication, whether it's to manage pain or other symptoms. It could also be a temporary life change, whether it's that you have just brought a new child into your family and that has limited the sleep you're getting, it has affected your cognition, it has affected your physical ability, and so on. And then there are situational disabilities, because not all of us are capable of doing all things at all times. You may be driving and unable to look at your phone, and so you depend on voice output. You may be unable to touch your phone, and so you depend on voice input. You may be walking out of the grocery store and your arms are full, and you now depend on the automatic doors to open for you. It's possible that you are pushing a stroller or towing a suitcase, and you now are dependent on curb cuts and things in the physical world that you never were before. And so, of course, a situational disability is something that will affect all of us. And it's important to recognize that when we make products that are more accessible, we're creating products that appeal to more people and that work for us in whatever situation and life circumstance we find ourselves in. However, even if we are lucky enough never to experience any kind of temporary disability, person with a disability is an identity that we will all adopt at some point during our lives. Because as we get older, our hand eye coordination isn't what it once was. Our memory and cognition aren't what they once were. Our hearing and our vision aren't what they once were when we are young. And so at some point, we may never change the identification of our ethnicity or our gender, but it is very likely that every single person listening to this talk today will at some point identify as a person with a disability. And so when we create products that are accessible, we're creating products that will work not just for ourselves right now, but for our future selves. And so when we think about prioritizing accessibility and the fixing of issues around people with disabilities, it really is important to widen the scope of what we mean by person with a disability and to widen the scope of what we think of when we think about accessibility and the benefits that it brings. But of course, it's even more important than designing products and services that work not just for us now, but for our future selves, that work for the 1 in 5 people with disabilities, and that work for us no matter what kind of life situation we may find ourselves in. Because when we prioritize accessibility, what we are really doing is prioritizing innovation. Think about the number of features in products that we use every day that started off as accessibility features. Voice recognition is now a key part of all of the hands-free systems we use in our cars, and it got started as a technology that was useful to those who could not use a standard keyboard or mouse due to their physical challenges. When we think about GPS, it is important to recognize that many of the early adopters of GPS systems were folks who were blind, who couldn't read maps and who couldn't navigate in the same way. I remember the first GPS system that I ever got was attached to a Braille note taker, and so I had kind of a GPS system that was attached to my shoulder because, of course, there was no cellular network, and it needed to have sensors on my shoulders so that it could contact the satellite. And of course, there was a computer on my back that stored all of the maps and did all of the route calculation. And then something else on kind of the front of my body that was a keyboard that let me do input and output. And then, of course, wires running from those things to an earbud that let me actually hear the voice and get turn-by-turn directions. There were many wires crisscrossing over my body, but the advantages that I was given by GPS really were worth it to me. And of course, texting is something that started out really as something that folks who were deaf and hard of hearing used to communicate and very quickly rolled out to be something that we all use on a daily basis. And then Siri and other home assistants. When I got a home assistant and began upgrading my own home to be a smart home, it was the first time that I could control my smart thermostat on my own and know the temperature of the house and change it and set it. And, doing that with a home assistant by your voice is something that is easier for everyone, but that makes new interactions possible for some folks. And that really gets into the idea that accessible products are better products. If we think about, for example, the electric toothbrush, it was originally invented for those who, due to physical challenges, could not brush their teeth and could not make that manual toothbrushing motion as easily as some of us could. But once the electric toothbrush was invented, it became clear that this is an easier and better way to brush your teeth because a lot of us don't put the time and care and effort into brushing our teeth that we should. And so something that makes it easier and more convenient isn't just great for people with disabilities, it's a better product for all of us. And we've got several other examples on this slide of things like curb cuts that make it possible for people in wheelchairs to cross the street. but that remove barriers for those of us with strollers or suitcases. Captions that make it possible for those who are deaf or hard of hearing to interact with videos, but that also make it possible for us to interact and enjoy videos when we're in a situation where we can't hear or can't enable sound. Or things like dark mode that make it possible for those who have light sensitivity to use products without encumbering eye strain, but that are something that all of us have come to love and depend on to use our phones and our screens in more adaptive ways that are better for all of us. And so prioritizing accessibility means prioritizing innovative solutions, customizable solutions, better UX for all. But how do we do it? The first key thing is to make sure that we are distributing accessibility through teams. Because, of course, as we all know, the popular saying says, many hands make light work. But there are a lot of accessibility myths. For example, that only developers do accessibility. Of course, developers have an important part to play in accessibility, but in order for a developer to write code that is accessible, they need to be given designs that are accessible. They need to be given UIs to create that are accessible. They need to be given systems and processes that have been thought out with accessibility in mind. Often we say that one person should be responsible for doing all accessibility work, or sometimes we say one team. But of course, one person or one team can't know everything that is going on in all of our organizations. They can't be at all of the tables thinking through all of the decisions. And if we centralize accessibility knowledge in one person or one team, quickly that team becomes overwhelmed and they become an accessibility blocker. And we start saying, well, it's going to get way too long and be too much effort to get accessibility to sign off on this. So let's work around them. We get the myth that accessibility is only about legal compliance. Of course, legal and compliance metrics are a great guideline for us to use when we're thinking about how accessible our experiences might be. But we find that if we think about accessibility exclusively through a compliance lens, we wildly underestimate just how many people accessibility will benefit. And we lose that innovation that comes from creating accessibility processes, from distributing accessibility knowledge, and from helping everyone on our teams from the top down to think accessibility and to integrate accessibility into all of our processes. Then we get the myth that accessibility is expensive. Of course, if accessibility is centralized or is thought of as a one-off or a one-time process, accessibility can be expensive. But if accessibility is integrated into the foundations of our processes and is made part of everything that we do, we quickly find that accessibility is not expensive. Accessibility is something that we can do at the same time we do all of our other work. Then we think that only experts can do accessibility. That thinking is directly born out of this idea of accessibility centralization and having one person or team that is an accessibility subject matter expert. Of course, expertise helps, but when we begin thinking about distributing accessibility throughout our organization, we find that developers need to know how to write code accessibly. Designers need to know how to create accessible designs. Content creators need to know how to write alt text and how to write content that is accessible to everyone. Project managers need to have a good idea of how accessibility will change their timelines, how it will be measured, how it will be benchmarked. And so if we all take on the little pieces of learning and knowledge that we need in order to create accessibility, we'll find that accessibility isn't a huge knowledge lift, and it doesn't require us to develop entirely new expertise. We need to get to a place where designers create accessible designs, programmers write accessible code, content creators produce accessible content, researchers perform inclusive research, managers ensure accessible processes, and HR departments build diverse teams so that project managers can prioritize accessibility. because accessibility is a process and a journey, not a one-off. And if we fail to integrate accessibility responsibilities and processes throughout our teams and our entire organization, we will find that we've caused accessibility failure in our product. That said, that's a very high-level overview of some of the things that we need to do in order to ensure that the accessibility that we all want actually happens. Let's drop down a level and talk about some of the things that we can do as part of these accessible processes. First of all, let's talk about automated testing. At Fable, we are very focused on user testing and on making sure that your products are tested by users who are people with disabilities. However, automated testing has an important place. Automated testing is repeatable. It can be integrated into your deployments and your other development processes, and it can detect easy-to-solve problems. And when it does that, detects those easy-to-solve problems, and is automatically in place to detect any regressions that you may have introduced, you'll find that it adds value to any of the manual testing that you are able to do. So don't be afraid of automated testing, but do understand its limitations. Automated testing gives no insight into how to actually prioritize fixing the long list of errors that you might get out of an automated test. It can only detect about 30% of the problems. It offers no context for how the issues it surfaces might affect people with disabilities, and it can require a little bit of training to understand the results. Just like any tool, automated accessibility testing tools are complicated tools that give very in-depth reports and have a great many settings and knobs that can be tweaked in ways that they can be run. However, that's why, on top of your robust, automated, repeatable automated testing framework that is run before deploys, that is detecting regressions, you also need user testing that involves people with disabilities, because that's the only way to prioritize accessibility. User testing gives you that insight from real users about how various accessibility issues are affecting them as they try to use your digital products and services. It helps your teams understand the effect of the accessibility problems that maybe your automated testing has already surfaced, or maybe it hasn't. And it helps your teams understand not only what's happening, but why it's happening. As well, user testing helps you socialize accessibility as an important concept. There is a real power to making sure that your teams are able to interact with and receive videos from people with disabilities using your actual product, because that will enrich and deepen their understanding of things like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and other accessibility requirements. Because if you are just presented with a list of requirements and not told why, it's very difficult for you to implement those requirements in meaningful, impactful, effective ways. And of course, user testing can help you shift accessibility left, because automated testing requires code that is already ready for deployment. Whereas when you're talking with real users, you can involve them in ideation, in design, in prototype reviews. Of course, user testing can be more costly than automated testing, and it may not be valuable for extremely inaccessible products. As someone with a disability myself, I have been put in the situation of having to test a product where there was no alt text. None of the buttons had been labeled for my screen reader. None of the links had meaningful labels. The layout was inaccessible and confusing. And so it was very, very difficult for me to provide feedback about how this could be improved, because I couldn't understand what any of the intent was. And so automated testing might be an important starting point. And you may want to make sure you're doing a little bit of that to at least make sure that some of those labels and basic things are in place so that you can get a great deal of value out of your user experience testing. So let's talk about prioritizing based on user testing. What we find when companies engage in user testing for the first time is that there are a lot of incomplete tasks. Those being tasks that you ask a user to attempt to perform on your product or website that they are unable to complete. And so that really helps you understand that the barriers someone encountered that blocked them from completing a task should obviously be number one high priority. Before you start thinking about things like making sure an experience is easy and joyful and fun and things like that, you want to make sure that you have achieved 100% task completion. The next thing then you can dive into is the frustration of tasks. Sometimes companies can think that time is a good metric here. However, at Fable, we find that it really isn't. Different IT users have different time expectations. And so what you want to be aiming to do is reduce frustration and make the user experience the best that it can be. One tool that we find very useful here is one that Fable developed, the AUS, Accessible Usability Scale. It's based on SUS, the System Usability Scale, something that you may be familiar with. And we find it can be a great accessibility benchmark into what that experience is actually like. Another thing to think about is how often users have to perform tasks. Because when you start your accessibility work, it's important to remember that accessibility is a journey and it's an ongoing task. And so you're not going to be perfect right away, and you're not going to solve all of the problems in the first swoop. And so one thing to think about is how often must a user do something? For me, for example, it is really critical to me that I be able to log into my bank every day and make transactions and check on my bank balance in ways that don't present barriers and that are very convenient for me with my screen reader. However, I find that I order a checkbook once every couple of years. So if there's an accessibility barrier there, it's frustrating, but I mean, I'd rather that the focus be on the things that I do every single day and really need to do independently, or else I'll have to switch banks. And hopefully that the check ordering experience will be fixed later on. But when you're thinking about prioritizing issues, it's super important. And of course, our workarounds available. It might be okay for me to have to visit a bank teller or call someone in order to order a checkbook, in ways that it is not okay for me to have to call a real person every day to check my bank balance. And so when you begin the user testing journey, the most important thing to do is to get started. And when you do get started, it's okay to focus on a single assistive technology. If you try to solve every problem for every user all at once, you'll find that you quickly get overwhelmed. So one pattern that we find useful is to focus on users of screen magnification, because they are already using vision. All they're doing is magnifying the screen. And so you want to make sure that it works for them. Next, you can expand into what we call alternative navigation. So that's folks who are using voice dictation, who are using adapted keyboards, adapted mice, that sort of thing. Because again, they're still using vision. And so they're still interpreting the user interface in a similar way to how you do. And then lastly, you can expand into screen reader testing. And when you do this, you'll also find that the processes you put into place, the things you learn, and the changes that you make for one AT type expand out and are useful to those other AT types as well. That said, it's also really important to keep the conversation going. I know this has been a super dense presentation, but it's important to think about these things and to keep the conversation moving, because accessibility isn't a once every 5-year project. It isn't a one-off. It's a process, and it is an ongoing thing that you need to be doing and measuring. And so I'd love to keep that conversation going. Feel free to follow me on LinkedIn or send me an email. And also feel free to follow Fable. to learn more about us and what we're doing, and to keep that conversation moving forward about how you and your organization can best get started on the accessibility journey and on prioritizing those accessibility issues that you may already have. That said, I'm really glad to get to talk to all of you today, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day and really enjoy the rest of this virtual conference.